So my name's John Henderson. As I said, I'm the chapter secretary for IGDA-Austin, and I have a disclaimer. This is actually going to be a lot of my own opinion, and it comes from talking to quite a lot of creative people, most of whom make games in Austin. And I am going to be presenting not just opinion, but some things as facts, so I take responsibility for all those facts. But if any of you are journalists and are wanting to write your own article, I suggest you find your own sources. A lot of this stuff is not impossible to find out, but it is non-trivial. So please don't take this as gospel, what I'm about to present to you. I am not offering a prescription, nor am I offering myself up as an example for anything, but I'm going to present a problem that you probably all thought of before, try to find a new way to think about it, maybe change the conversation a little. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is balance, and there's a lot of ways to think about this. The main thrust of why I'm even choosing balance as a topic is obviously there's lots of different ways we could think about the choices we make, and oftentimes we have to make both of them in different degrees. I'm also going to just state as a given that creative people are defined as people who have some need to create. Whatever need that comes from is individual. But there's also one balance in particular I want to talk about, but this is not it. Yeah, this is the distraction. Usually when people are talking about the creative balance that people have to come up with, especially if they're professional, this is the first thing that comes to mind. I don't think this is completely a false dichotomy, but it's something that people already know how to talk about. It comes up all the time, especially in terms of are jobs available and who's working for whom. But most people, individuals, don't have the power to affect this directly. So I'd rather talk about something else. This is one I want to talk about tonight. On one side, all the realities associated with being a creative professional, and then on the other hand, actually making things. What do I mean by this? Well, for example, do people have jobs that prevent them from doing the creative things they want to do? When was the last time they talked to a regular person that cares about them as a person about what it is they do? Or do they feel empowered to do that? So who exactly has to keep this balance for the sake of professionalism? Well, ask yourself this question: is there money involved? It's a trick question. There's always money involved. And if there's money involved, if there's someone who has to pay the price of admission, you have to be a professional. So there's no two ways around it. There's this other thing that I thought about when I first decided to make balance the topic of this speech, is what I call the Nietzschean balance. And again, it's not really a balance. He didn't call it a balance. He called it a fine line between these two things, madness and greatness. And as it turns out, I have enough to say about both of them. But for the sake of time, and considering I only have 10 minutes, I have a lot to say about madness. And that's pretty much everything I'm going to be talking about tonight. Greatness will have to wait for another time. But there was this show that I did back at the start of the year on January 4th at KLRU Studio 6A. It was called Not the End of the World. And it was supposed to be ironic in a way. I was trying to find ways to make people feel good about starting a new year after a year that had kind of been a bummer in lots of different ways. But I wanted to point out how at least 5 really important games came out of Austin during that calendar year, roughly. And more than half of the people, thousands of people who are making games in Austin worked on some of those projects. So this is what it kind of looked like. We had 7 people representing 5 different companies, and Jennifer Bullard, who won't be here tonight because this is actually her wedding anniversary. And in part, not just because of what we were trying to do with the show, but I wanted to talk about it being a point in time at the very start of the year, and what's happened since then. Well, what happened since then? A lot of madness happened since then. What do I mean by this? Well, for one thing, THQ, the parent company of Vigil, which was based here in town, went bankrupt, and Vigil did not find a new owner. So January 23rd, less than 3 weeks after the show, this local studio that was actually represented in the show closed. About 80 people were working there at the time. And that wasn't all. Disney decided to cut back. And they had another large studio here in town, Junction Point, employed about 120 people. Closed that the next week. There was another studio in town, Playdom. They partially closed at that, or they laid up some of the people then, and then the rest of them in May. And then they just kept on going. Zynga, which is actually still here in town, they had consolidated all their quality assurance here in town into one shop they called AQC, ran it up in Lakeline. They closed that down. About 100 people in QA got laid off in one stroke. So let's remind ourselves exactly why I had this show in the first place. Well, between then and now, about 300 people technically lost their jobs. Not all of them are full-time, some are part-time, but so much for optimism. But wait, let's think about this constructively. Later that month, the studio head of Vigil, David Adams, made a deal with Crytek to open the very first office that Crytek has had in North America. About 35 people that used to work for Vigil now form the Crytek office, and they've grown considerably. So he effectively saved half a team. And besides that, that included those two guys. So keep it in perspective, about 300 people lost their jobs, but I can unqualifiedly say that most of them found new jobs, and a lot of them were still working here. And meanwhile, Disney employees, they got, at least the full-timers got 3 months paid time off, and THQ people got severance. So it wasn't as bad as it could have been, I guess. And then meanwhile, we've got a bunch of new studios that are starting up here. Cloud Imperium, Battlecry, EA's offices, lots of stealth and independent projects, and lots more. I'm not going to read them all because it would take too long, but companies here in town. But the question that came to mind at that point was, I know a lot of people don't like this happening, and I mean, every time it does happen, when there's a major studio closure or layoff, people complain about it, and that's right to do that, but I'm trying to give you something else to think about, and that's kind of why I suggested the other balance. And more importantly, we've been here before. This has effectively happened every 4 years for the past 12 here in Austin. I mean, we have rises and falls. We are not immune to boom and bust. And more than that, every time it's happened, there's been at least one major project waiting in the wings to pick up a lot of the people and keep working here in Austin. So again, back to this. I would really like to see more people thinking about, or at least devoting some time to this balance, because this is something that you should be able to feel empowered to deal with. I mean, not everyone is going to be able to employ themselves. However, that's probably going to be more common than it has been in the past. But, okay, so what do I really mean by this? What is the real risk of having an imbalance? Well, you can tip. And I don't mean, strictly speaking, the Malcolm Gladwell tipping point. I mean, something will shock you to your core, and you won't be ready to handle it if you don't have this personal balance handled. So what can it look like if you tip? Well, we kind of had an example about that 2 weeks ago. If anyone who doesn't know this is Phil Fish. He made a game about a year ago, or came out on Xbox 360, called Fez, and it was a relatively successful game, and then about 13 months later, a Windows version came out. It's currently rated 91 in Metacritic. Well, back in June at E3, he announced that he was working on a sequel called Fez 2. Well, 2 months after that, he got into a fight on Twitter with someone, and then he announced that he hated everything about the game industry and he was going to quit. He said, the quote is there, "I take the money and I run." There's a lot of people that care a lot more about him that still don't know what to make of this. And honestly, I don't know him from Adam. I've been in the same room with this man once. I don't know what's in his mind or in his head. And honestly, it's his project. If he doesn't want to work on it, and maybe he didn't really want to work on it in the first place. But since he made it my prerogative, of course I got an opinion on this. There's two conclusions, I think. One, we should point out how whenever a creative person decides just not to work on a project and just drops it, no one benefits from that. Now, obviously, it's his prerogative if he wants to work on it at all, but we potentially lost something that could have been good, and he was the only one who was going to do that. Also, I mean, consider that he was an independent developer, and he probably didn't have a whole lot of other people that were working with him. If he was working for a larger company, there would probably be someone's job to interface with the public and maybe not fight with them. You know, maybe someone in community management or customer service or marketing. Someone who could just turn to him and say, why don't you take care of what you're best at? I got this. And maybe it wouldn't have been so jarring. So in conclusion, you know, this is there are worse things than being without work for a while. And I know I'm taking a big risk by saying something like that, but I really do care about the people who are working here in Austin. I would rather that not be the entire focus of what we're doing here and now. And really, don't just take my word for it. As it turns out, a lot of the speakers you'll hear tonight have kind of the same thing in mind. So, thanks very much. Welcome to Microtalks. This is City Hall.